All right. Y'all ready to start? Ready or not, we are going to start. Okay. All right. We got to page 97. That's where we're going. And I hope what's happening here in this class is that it's just helping you with when you study other Bible passages, other Bible subjects, and other Bible books, that it will give you, because this is kind of an overview, but we're looking geographically at some things there. And I hope that you can visualize where it's taking place. So we're starting on an overview of the divided kingdom. Now, I gave you some dates probably about this and some things that took place in Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And then, let's see, I gave you a chart last week. And on that chart, it has the United Kingdom dates from 1095 to 975. Okay. And so if we start with 975, then when the kingdom divided between Jeroboam and Rehoboam, then we go from there, and the kings of Israel, then that lasted. If you look at the chart on the bottom of the chart, have you got one? Okay, you don't? Okay. This is kind of, all right. You got one last week though, didn't you?
Yes, sir.
Okay. If you look at the bottom of the kings of Israel at 722 BC, that's when we're talking about divided kingdom. Okay. Are you with me, Justin, on that one?
Yes, sir.
Okay. All right. So that's where we've gone from 975 to the 722 BC. Okay. The 975 is when they divided. There was Jeroboam, the first king, and Rehoboam was the king of Judah. And then the Israel lasted 720, to 722 BC. Now, I've got some things I want to go over, but I want you to notice on the map on page 101. Okay. On the map, I'm hoping you see where Judah is. Look at the top of the Red Sea, and you'll find mine's a gray line that goes through almost right at Gilgal, then right underneath Bethel, Mizpah, and then go all the way up north, just north of Joppa. Do y'all see that line? Okay. All right. Now look at Bethel, and then go all the way up north. All right, north of the Lake of Hulon, and really this is still the Jordan River going up through there, and right up there you'll see Dan. Okay, now Jeroboam set up a golden calf at Dan and then at Bethel. Okay, and that's how far apart they were. Now he did that so that the children of Israel wouldn't have to go back to Jerusalem to offer their worship to God. Now I want you to look also at Shechem. Well, Samaria, really, it's Samaria, but it's still in that same area. But Samaria, that's going to become the capital then of Israel. All right. And that will be, as we talked about in John chapter 4 and then Acts chapter 8, those two things. And then there's Mount Ebal, Mount Gerizim. We talked about those two mountains beforehand. So let's go back to 97. That's what we're going to talk about some tonight. And I want to get to I got some things we have to travel through. So we're going to kind of sum up some things, deal with this, and because I want to get through and talk about the New Testament then next week. All right. In the middle of the page where it says Judah in the south still worship God at the temple in Jerusalem, and yet so often it was only a ritual type of worship. with some idols then set up across town. The moral and religious decay of the period was heartbreaking to see. And this is true. Okay. Gradually, the Levites who served around the temple moved south. And if you'll remember then those 48 cities that we talked about, and I don't think we mentioned them explicitly. We mentioned the 6 cities of refuge, but what happened was then the priests that were scattered abroad in the northern kingdoms came down to Judah, and all the righteous people then came down to Judah because of what was taking place in the northern kingdoms. Okay. Let's see. And then the next paragraph, for about 200 years, the divided kingdom continued. It was one of the darkest periods of all Old Testament history. Part of the time, Israel and Judah warred against each other, so there was civil war. Part of the time, the neighboring kingdoms such as Moab and Edom would be tributaries. Other times, they would rebel. There would be more fighting. A total of 39 kings in the 2 kingdoms. 13 of them were murdered by their own people. 2 were killed in battles. 5 kings were taken prisoner by the enemy kings. And all the kings of the northern the kings of Israel were all bad. Okay, there were a few that were good on Judah's side. All right. Now the next paragraph: Israelites kept detailed historical records of their kings that we no longer have. That was Israel then. Instead, we have their religious history. That's reading 1st and 2nd Kings and Chronicles and those type of things. And he says, take your red pen and do that. But what I'm suggesting is if you read that, and when you read that, then just kind of keep that in mind that all of these kings were bad. And then you have and there's some, he's giving you really a detailed history of what's taking place religiously for the 2 groups of people and what they went through. All right. Then in the southern kingdom, the kings were all direct descendants of David. And you need to, if you underline that, mark that, however, but that is true. All of the kings. Now, that's why they kept, when we turn to Matthew chapter 1, it says that it begins by saying, here is the generations of the book of David and then the book of Abraham. So if you can, then Jesus could prove that he was from that lineage. And that's done in Matthew chapter 1, but also in Luke chapter 3, I believe it is, that lineage line is proven. And nobody ever questioned that in the whole New Testament. Now, if they could have, they would have, but they did not question that Jesus then was from the tribe of Judah. And that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 49, that the scepter shall not part from Judah. Now, notice something also. It says this was a fulfillment of the promise made to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 and verse 12. That is an important and key prophecy that God made to David. All right. Let's see. Meanwhile, the last paragraph, the northern kingdom went from bad to worse. As we have already stated, Jeroboam set up his gods with a new system of worship. Now, they changed the priesthood. They changed the place. They changed the time. All of this was changed. Okay. They changed it from the 7th month to the 8th month, and there was just a bunch of changes. There was never a good king in Israel. They either worshiped Jeroboam's golden calves, or they did worse and worshipped Baal, the god of the Canaanites. The ruling families of Israel changed 9 times. Some men were murdered. Some destroyed his family and then proclaimed himself king. God sent prophets after prophets to warn the destruction, but they were ignored. And that's what we're going to talk about really in Ezekiel tonight. The neighboring people had resented Solomon's control over them, over the trade routes, and they were quickly to be thrown off Israel's control when the kingdom divided. Moab, Edom, Ammon, and Syria all rebelled, and Egypt soon attacked. And so that's what's taking place. Now, if we looked at the trade routes that we noticed earlier in our study, then Israel held some of those portions of the Transjordan Plateau and therefore could tax caravans or on a portion of the King's Highway. So that's how they got some of their money. In contrast, though, the next paragraph, Judah was landlocked, and the main routes avoided the more difficult roads through the hill country. The Dead Sea was a natural barrier on the east, and the Philistines still held firm hold on the southern coastal plain. Sometimes Judah controlled part of Edom and held access to the riches of Ezon-Geber, but were often either Egypt or Edom took that prize away. Therefore, Israel tended to be a more prosperous nation with more contact with other people. This prosperity was a mixed blessing, however. They tended to be at ease and to forget their need for Jehovah. That's the way we still are today. Notice also, not the next, after space, it says, God sent inspired preachers or prophets to his people through their history. These were men who sought to encourage the people to serve God faithfully and to point out the error of their action. As the years passed, people became more and more wicked and refused to listen. Prophets began writing their message as proof that God had given warning of his punishments to come. And that's really some of our major prophets. Isaiah talks about some of those, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and then some of the minor prophets also do that. Now notice also the chart that you have there where you see David, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram. Now notice Omri, Ahab. Now who was Ahab's wife? Jezebel. All right, now under that you have Athaliah. Okay, Athaliah married Jehoram, and then there was that mixed time when they were then together. Part of the things that go in there. So we have a chart of the kings. Did we notice that last week? This chart of the kings that we start on page 102. I think I made mention of it, and then I gave you this chart to go by rather than that. And that continues then on. Let's see. I want us to look at page 111 and notice that map. And notice where Judah is, okay? This would be at the height of Judah. They controlled the Philistines, and they controlled Edom. And then notice Israel, how much land they controlled. Israel, and then all the way down to Moab, all the way up to Syria, and those type of things. I want you to notice that. That is the land area that they controlled. And that's what we talked about in that one little section there. Let's continue on. All right, the fall of Israel on page 119. Now, when was the fall of Israel? Date?
722.
That's right. Now, who? To whom?
The Assyrians.
Assyrians. Now, what did the Assyrians do with the people?
They carried them off.
All right, they carried them off.
They brought in different people.
They brought in other people. And why I'm repeating this is because I've noticed that on my recordings, your recording, your answer's not there. So, okay. That's right. So there was this that intermingled, and that's then set the stage for the Samaritans of the New Testament. So what we're doing now is setting the stage, getting some of the historical events that would take place. We've got to remember this as we're coming into the New Testament. What is the stage for the New Testament? So we find the Samaritans and how they came and what took place at 722 BC. All right. Now let's notice the map on page 121 for a minute. And that's a bigger map. You remember we talked about this map had the Fertile Crescent there. But we find the Assyrian Empire. You see how much, mine is all one color. I don't know what color yours is, but mine's all one color. That Assyrian Empire, you see it went all the way over to Babylon, all the way up, and then it came down. They conquered Egypt, and in between there was that little, there's that little other color of Israel, or Judah, I mean, Judah. But here was then the Assyrian and their empire and what they controlled. That was the people that carried then that northern group into captivity. Now, let's see what else I need to do before we get. All right, now let's go to page 124. Now, notice up there the last Judah's last days. Okay, because of the sin that they were committing, and Isaiah prophesied this. Now, Isaiah prophesied about 750 BC. Okay, now he is prophesying of what's going to take place to Judah. Now, Judah's going to go in, and Jeremiah is also going to prophesy this. And Jeremiah, Daniel, and Ezekiel are contemporaries. But Judah's going to go into captivity in 606 BC. And there's two other carryings away. And this is our class then. We're dealing with this on the other times of 597 and 586, the other carrying away that Ezekiel would be prophesying and trying to help these people straighten up and fly right. But from 606, we're going to number 70 years. That would be 536. And there was a small remnant of people. Now we've got to remember there was that small remnant then that came back, and they rebuilt Jerusalem, or rebuilt the temple and Jerusalem, the walls around it. So this was then, you got your dates of 606 and 536. And you can see the prophets that there was there: Isaiah, there's Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, and Jeremiah. I would throw Daniel in there too. Okay, and you're talking about there. So we have those books that talk about Israel's or Judah's last days. Okay, and then there's another map, and you see where how far Assyrian comes down to, all the way where Philistines used to be, and then they have a Moab, Ammon, all of this. Then I want you to be aware of those areas then where Judah was going to be carried away. Now all right, on page 132, he has the captivity. And really what I want to deal with here, yes, I want us to notice in Daniel chapter 2. Okay. And I think this is a good place to deal with Daniel chapter 2. All right, and in this chapter, we find that Nebuchadnezzar has a dream. And then in verse 2, it says, the king commanded to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to show the king his dream. And they came and stood before the king. And the king said unto them, I have dreamed a dream. My spirit has troubled to know the dream. And then spake the Chaldeans to the king in Salak, so there's no L in there, Sarik. O king, live forever. Tell thy servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. And the king answered and said to the Chaldeans, the thing is gone from me. If you will not make known to me the dream with the interpretation thereof, ye shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made a dunghill. And so that's what he demanded. And then we find that this is about to take place when Daniel hears about it. And then Daniel says, let me go to God in prayer and let me find out this. Verse 13, and the decree went forth, and the wise men should be slain. And they sought Daniel and his fellows to be slain. So I think the slaying of some of the wise men had already started. And Daniel answered with the counsel and with wisdom to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, which was gone forth to slay the wise men. And so he asked for this, and he gets the time. And then Daniel, let's see. Daniel tells the king the dream. Where do I want to start then? All right. Of course, Daniel's going to God and asking and knowing that God's going to do it. All right, the king, then verse 26. The king answered and said to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, art thou able to make known unto me the dream which I have seen and the interpretation thereof? And Daniel answered in the presence of the king and said, the secret which the king hath demanded cannot the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, the soothsayers show it to the king? And I think he's having a little bit of fun there. But there is a God in heaven that revealeth secrets and maketh known to the king Nebuchadnezzar what shall be in the latter days, and thy dream and thy visions, thy head upon thy bed are these. As for thee, O king, thy thoughts came into my mind in thy bed, that thou shouldst come to pass hereafter, and he that revealeth secrets maketh known to thee what shall come to pass. But as for me, this secret is not revealed to me for any wisdom that I have more than any living, but for their sake that shall make known the interpretation to the king, and thou mightest know that the thoughts in thine heart. And thou, O king, sawest, behold, a great image. This great image, whose brightness was excellent, stood before thee, and the form thereof was terrible. And the image's head was of fine gold, and breast was arms of silver, and belly, and his thighs of brass, his legs of iron, his feet part iron and part clay. Thou sawest till the stone that was cut out without hands, which smote the image upon his feet, that there were of iron and clay, and brake them to pieces. Then the iron and the clay and the brass and the silver and the gold broke into pieces, and became like a chaff of the summer threshing floor, and the wind carried them away, that no place was found for them. And the stone that smote the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. And this is the dream, and we will tell the interpretation before the king. O thou, O king, art the king of kings, for God of heaven hath given thee a kingdom, power, strength, and glory. And wherefore the children of Israel dwell in the beasts of the field and the fowl of the air of the heaven hath he given in thy hand, and hath made thee ruler over them. Thou art the head of fine gold. Now understand, he said thou art the head of fine gold. So here's the interpretation. The image started out with gold. He is the gold. Yeah. And after thee shall rise another kingdom inferior to thee, and another third kingdom of brass, and shall rule over thee. And the fourth kingdom then shall be strong. Okay. As iron, so much as iron breaketh in pieces, and shall do these things, and as iron breaketh these, and it shall break into pieces and be bruised. Now drop down to verse 44. In the days of these kings, that's that fourth world power, shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom which shall never be destroyed, and the kingdom shall not be left to other people, but it shall break in pieces and consume all these kingdoms, and it shall stand forever. So here is then, they're in that captivity. Here is Judah, they're in captivity. And here is Nebuchadnezzar, he's going to have this dream, and here are four world powers then. We're setting up then for the New Testament. Four world powers. You're going to have Babylon, you're going to have the Medo-Persian, that's Daniel chapter 5. You're going to have the Grecian, which is Alexander the Great, and then you're going to have the Romans. And in the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. All right. Now, if you go back when he's telling the dream, he says that in the days then of that fourth world power, there's going to be a stone that's going to come and break into pieces, and consume then the whole earth. That's the church. Okay. All right. That's Daniel chapter 2, verse 44. In the days of these kings shall the God of heaven set up a kingdom. So that's the church then that God has set up, and that will go throughout and has gone throughout from that time. But we're setting the stage then. We need to understand that the world, in Galatians chapter 4 and verse 4, in the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, made of woman, made under the law. And it was, the time was right. There was a language, there was highways, there was travel, and there was the world power that was in there. All of those things were necessary for the God of heaven to set up a kingdom. And all of those pointing then to that. All right. So, captivity. All right. So we read that then, what's going to take place, and that's Daniel and Ezekiel, and then the Medo and the Persian. This is Daniel chapter 5, and I mentioned that, did I not? Daniel chapter 5, the handwriting on the wall. That's when the Medo-Persians take over. Now, if you turn to page 136 on your map, you'll find where the Babylonian kingdom then took place. Okay. Then to that north of that, you see where the Medo-Persian power was. Now they're going to come down and they're going to take all that pink area where Medo-Persian is, or where Babylon is. The Medo-Persian is going to come down there. Now the Medo-Persian is going to allow then the children of Israel to come back. Isaiah prophesied that there would be one by the name of Cyrus who would allow them to come back. And they used that and showed then to Cyrus that he was mentioned in the Bible beforehand, and that he would allow the children of Israel to come back and rebuild not only the walls, but also the temple. And that's what they did. Okay. Then on the next page, 139, you'll see that the Medo-Persian, they really ruled a lot more than that. But there's the Medo-Persian Empire. All right, now notice on page 142. Now the Babylon had destroyed and burnt Jerusalem. Okay, there was, in essence, there was not one stone left upon another. As it was then in AD 70, the city was ravaged, and Nehemiah goes back and looks at the wall, and there's some places that he can't even walk. He has to get up. Well, he can't ride. He has to get off, and he has to walk through some of the rubble. Now, if you'll notice, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, these are called post-exile prophets. Okay, post-exile prophets. That means that they prophesied after that. After the exile. This will be then the 536 in that time, between 536 and 400. Now, during this time, especially during Nehemiah's time, we're going to get more into this. So when you read that book and study that book, you're going to see that there's the background for the Sadducees and the Pharisees and those people then. And here is that background, so that when they come up into Jesus' time, they're already there. But here is the beginning of those things, and I've got some more information on that that I want us to notice. Where was that? Oh, I thought I had it marked. Yeah, there it is. All right. Now, what I want to notice also is another, before I get to where I was looking for. On page 149. All right, from the book of Malachi to the book of Matthew. How many years? You know, 400 years. 400 years of silence then. And really it's from Malachi to John the Baptist. All right, so there's 400 years. So we find these things then, the development, and you can read some of this if you want to about the Maccabean pages or ages and that type of thing. Now on page 353, we want to spend the rest of our time right there. Let's see, which will set us up then for the New Testament then. All right, I've got some other things there. All right, now notice on page 153, under language change. Y'all see where I'm at? Okay. In lesson 35, we note that the Jewish men of Judah intermarried with their neighbors, and their children spoke a corrupt language, which likely include Aramaic plus the ancient tongue of their mother people, which would be Hebrew, with the possibility, well, a little Hebrew thrown in. Nehemiah 8 tells of an occasion when the people gathered near Ezra, gathered to hear Ezra read the law of Moses. 13 men are named who stood beside Ezra and caused the people to understand the law. Now they stood from morning. Now, if you wanted something interesting to preach on, the people stood from morning till noon. And that's in Nehemiah chapter 8. But also in there's another interesting thing. They built the walls in Jerusalem like in 52 days, for the people had a mind to work. So when the people of God and have God behind them want to do something, it can get done. Okay. It's quite plausible to think that their task was to give an oral interpretation from the Hebrew text to the common Aramaic language of the day, and that could have been, but they should have known. During these years, then, of biblical science, another language became prominent. The Greek language was official tongue of both Assyrian and Egyptian empires. Every educated person was able to read, write, and to speak Greek fluently. And that's why in our New Testament, when we have our New Testament given, that Greek language, it's called Koine Greek. That's the common Greek. And it is then a dead language. The words are not evolving. In English, we have words that are still evolving. Okay. If I asked you what bread was, what would you say bread was, Justin?
Both bread.
Okay. What would you say?
Some roll.
Okay. All right. Now, when I was growing up, bread meant money. Okay. Other things that it could mean. So it changes. It evolves then. Okay. The Koine Greek does not change. Now, the Greek, people are speaking Greek today, but it can evolve. It can change. But that Koine Greek, that's why our dictionaries are so important to know about and have a dictionary of New Testament words. So if you don't have that part of your library, or you're young enough, get you a good Bible program, and it has several dictionaries, and it'd be worth it. Okay, so here's that language then, a universal language. So when Paul then was preaching, he could go anywhere in his preaching, and he could speak Greek, but he was also multi-language. You know, he could speak Hebrew and that's the other, and he did that from time to time to be able. So that was important. That's the beginning. Here is the setting of the stage then for the New Testament. Let's turn over to page 154. All right. I mentioned this. Notice under Jewish individuality, we have, as we indicated, Jews were scattered everywhere. Let us stop and look at some of the reasons why. It was over 700 years before Christ, when the kingdom of Israel was removed from the land by the Assyrians. A century later, Judah was scattered by Babylon. Permission was granted for all Jews to go home in Cyrus's day, but most did not. Now that's important because we're talking about that remnant then. Most did not. Those who remained behind were scattered throughout the Mesopotamia and Persia. Now, during the Egyptian control of Palestine, the Egyptians welcomed any who chose to migrate there. Later, the Assyrians gained control and more migration occurred. Some of the Jews accepted the Hellenistic lifestyle readily. Now, a Hellenistic Jew was one who was a Jew but was not born in Judah. Okay. Now, if we look at Acts chapter 6. Okay. Although he doesn't call them Hellenistic Jews, he calls them Grecian Jews. In those days, when the number of the disciples were multiplied, there arose a murmuring of the Grecians against the Hebrews because their widows were neglected in the daily ministration. So here, then, some of those people came back. And when you look at Acts chapter 2, really, this is a better one. When you look at who was there, Acts 2 and let's start with verse 8. How hear we every man in his own tongue wherein he was born? Now, these are all Jews, though, but notice where they're from. Parthians, Medes, and Elamites, dwellers of Mesopotamia, Judea, Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia, Phrygia, Pamphylia, Egypt, and all parts of Libya, about Cyrene, and strangers of Rome, Jews and proselytes, Cretes, Arabians, We do hear them speak in our own tongues the wonderful works of God. So some of these were proselytes, and I'm not denying that. But some of these were what would be called Hellenistic Jews. They were Jews, but they were born in other places other than Judea. Okay, does that make sense? Okay, and that's what he's talking about. All right, they accepted the Hellenistic lifestyle. The others resisted strongly. Even the Hellenistic Jews remembered he was one of God's chosen people, but they would still try to come back to Jerusalem during those times of sacrifice. Those scattered furthest from home still observed the laws of Moses and looked for the Messiah. This is also when the synagogues were established, because some of these people were so far away. This would be even in the Babylonian captivity. They would establish then the synagogue, and that's where they would have then their rolls of Old Testament, and they would then meet there, and they would study the scriptures, and they'd do those things that they couldn't do on a daily basis. They couldn't go back to Jerusalem, but this is where they would meet for religious instruction. Okay. All right, notice also the next paragraph. The term Gentile took on a new connotation during this period. Originally, it meant a people and was used to refer to any nation, including the Jews. As the Jews began to pride themselves more and more as God's chosen people, the word took on a hostile meaning. By New Testament days, the Jewish mind divided all the world's population into two groups, Jews and Gentiles. Now, when you study your New Testament, keep that in mind. And it mentions the Jew and the Gentile. Romans chapter 1 and verse 16, I'm not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God to salvation to everyone that believeth, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile, or to the Greek. Okay? And so if you weren't a Jew, you were a Gentile. That's all there was. All right. And since particularly all the people around the Jews were caught up in the Grecian culture, the term Greek was sometimes used. All right, now notice the religious changes. Okay. Changes in religious attitude were significant as any of the other changes of the period. Idolatry was the major threat to Jewish faithfulness through all the years from Moses to the captivity. Now you remember when Moses was up on the mount, what did the people get Aaron to do? Build a golden calf. So they were, they were idolaters. It was easy for them to go into idolatry. They had to have something that they could see, something they could feel. Okay. All right. Then let's go on. God punished his people severely, and that particular lesson was never forgotten. After the captivity, the Jews abhorred any semblance of idolatry. Their houses might have intricate abstract carving, but never representation of any plant or animal. Any loyal Jew would give his life rather than worship an idol. That's after the captivity that happened. It really, it got them out of this idolatrous worship. Okay. It seems the Jews originally trusted the truth that Jehovah was their God. They seemed to think that whether they obeyed him or not had nothing to do with the treatment of them, in spite of all the warnings from the prophets. They held to a one-sided covenant. That was God's side. Ezra is given credit for the awakening to the determination to keep the details of the law. An original idea was good, but the pendulum swung too far. They decided that the path of God's favor lay in perfect obedience. Now, they could not keep it perfectly. It was as if they thought God would be obliged to take care of them if they kept a certain number of prescribed laws. Neither idea was correct. Now, I want to talk about this. Gradually, teachers began to argue over how to keep the law exactly. Long, involved discussions were conducted. These discussions resulted in development, and he gives the couple of people here of their Really, it became their interpretation of the law. And we see that then, although God doesn't call them their different theologies and their different interpretations, he doesn't directly call them that, but you can find the inference to some of these ideas. And we'll get into that just two more. The Haggadah consisted of the expositions and legendary explanations of the historical and prophetic books of the Old Testament. The Halakhiah was a collection of rules which regulated conduct to the smallest details. Later, these traditions, which were oral at this point in history, were organized and written in the Talmud. Okay, so that's how the Talmud then began to be developed. Now, when I think even in Jesus' time, they had this Talmud. He didn't call it the Talmud, but it would be there. These traditions were not inspired of God. Remember, Jesus talked about in Matthew chapter 15 about washing their hands, and it became then a ritual of how it became a religious thing about washing your hands. If you didn't wash them the correct way, they thought you were wrong. And Jesus said, well, here's what else you've done, right? And that's why the traditions of men are separated from the commandments of God. These traditions were not inspired, but Jews gradually came to give them greater honor than the scriptures themselves. Attitudes such as mercy, justice, and honesty were hard to measure. On the other hand, it was easy to know whether one had circumcised his child or had given the tenth of his income to God, or had kept the Sabbath day. And really, the keeping of the Sabbath day, the idea of 7/10 of a mile, then that's when it became, because you'll never find that in the Jewish law, okay, in book of Exodus or Leviticus or Deuteronomy. You'll never find that it's 9/10 or 7/8 of a law. Not there. And the way they circumvented that is, what they would say is, where you eat is where your home is. So they would go less than 7/8 of a mile, and they would put food. Then they would go another and put food, and then they would go another, and they said, well, this is my home, this is my home, this is my home. So they got around that. I mean, they always were looking for loopholes, and that's not what God wanted. Okay, never did want those type of things. But they measured it. They had it on the 8th day. That child was to be circumcised. Well, here Jesus was healing people on the Sabbath day, and there was a man that Jesus said, "Pick up your bed and walk," and they thought he was working. That's not work. And so they had their rules, their man-made rules became more honor than the law of God. All right, and that's what he says here. Therefore, it was the various ceremonial rites that began to be stressed. It is fascinating to read some of these rules in the Mishnah. For example, the law said that they could not kindle a fire on the Sabbath day. So the Jews then would not open the door opposite of a burning candle, lest he make it burn brighter, thus kindling a fire. You see, they get, really ridiculous. All right, now this next part is important too. We do not have a record of the origin of any specific sects. We do know that there was an early group called the Hashim, or the pious ones, and they were very strict in their observance of the law of Moses and very firm in their opposition to anything that might corrupt their Jewish system of religion. Seemingly, the Pharisees rose out of this group. Now, you can go back to Nehemiah, and you can find some of this going on, the beginning of it. The Pharisees were ordinarily middle-class Jews who strongly resisted the Greek influence. The name is thought to mean the separated ones. But no one knows its origin, although there was many who were Pharisees in their outlook. The fraternity itself numbered only about 6,000. The Pharisees had a great effect on the religious masses. The Apostle Paul was a Pharisee. All right, now notice the next paragraph. Okay. In contrast to the Pharisees, a sect rose called the Sadducees. Now, how do you keep the difference between the Sadducees and the Pharisees separate? How do you remember that?
They're sad, you see, because they have no hope.
All right. They don't believe in
Life after death.
life after death, so they're sad, you see. That's the way I do that. But yeah, it's basically the same thing. All right. All right. Again, their origin is unknown. The party was made up largely of priests and aristocrats, though it is a matter of record that many priests were also Pharisees. Nicodemus was a Pharisee. Okay. The high priest was given great political power during this era, so there was no surprise that he and associates were very conscious of the advantages of political compromise. The typical Sadducee was very wealthy. They believed in God and the law, but they rejected most of the traditions, the interpretations of the Pharisees. They doubted that there was life after death, supernatural beings. That's why when they come to Jesus and asked about the man that had 7 brothers, or they had a wife and then married 7 brothers, and they asked the question, then in the resurrection, who shall they be? And Jesus said, you don't know the power of God. And then he says that we'll be like the angels of heaven. All right. So there is that. Then notice there's the Essenes, the next group. So here's 4 groups. Objected to the Pharisees also. They moved in the opposite direction of the Sadducees. The Sadducees considered the Pharisees too strict. The Essenes considered them dangerously liberal. They were also distressed over the conditions in Jerusalem. They withdrew and established their own community in Quorum on the northeast shore of the Dead Sea. Okay, that would be AD 70 where they found them. Then notice also the next group is called the Zealots. Thought that the Jewish state should be established at all costs, and usher in a glorious messianic priest kingdom in Jerusalem. Many revolts through the years started with the Zealots. Thus, the party was one of the many factors that led to the final destruction of Jerusalem. So here is then the background for the children for the New Testament. Now I'm going to notice another chart very quickly here on page 168. Now this is the Herodian family. This is Herod the Great, and his was the Herod that was when Jesus was born. This is the Herod that was there. Okay, then he had, if you'll follow this down over to the left side, you'll see there was Herod the second, Agrippa, and these type of things. Then you find Agrippa II and Drusilla, and all of these people. You need to study this because this will help you. And if we study the book of Acts, where you find Matthew and then all this kind of thing, you'll need to know these. Okay, so be familiar with those individuals then when you study. Now we're going to get into we will, Lord willing, next week get into the life of Christ, and then I want to deal with then Paul's missionary journeys and those type of things. So you'll need to know those journeys, and whether that should take us up through the end of the quarter. I think we've got 2 more weeks this week or this month?
Yes.
And then we'll have one week in June. Yes, because the 14th I won't be here. So we have 3 more times. We have 4 more class periods then. Okay. All right. All right. Any questions about tonight's class? Okay. Very good. I appreciate it.